What if I told you that being a German soldier in World War II wasn't just about battles and uniforms, but about the raw human grind of surviving one day at a time, about eating bread so hard it could break your teeth, about boots filled with straw just to keep from freezing, about laughing at lice because humor was the only weapon left against despair? Imagine living in trenches where silence was louder than gunfire, marching for days with blisters tearing your feet apart, clutching a letter from home like it was treasure, and finding beauty in something as simple as frost glittering on barbed wire or a song hummed in the dark. These soldiers carried fear in their bones, courage in small routines, guilt in silence, and memory in every keepsake hidden in their pockets. Their story is not one of glory, but of fragile humanity, of longing, laughter, exhaustion, and the strange rituals that kept them alive. Tonight, we're going beyond the history books to explore what it truly felt like to be a German soldier in W2, told in a way that will pull you in, keep you listening, and stay with you long after. The Final Whisper. It is strange to imagine yourself inside the boots of a German soldier in the Second World War, because when we think of that time, history books usually rush past the small human details, leaving only the large shadows of battles, names of cities, and the unshakable weight of ideology. But here, in this quiet space, we can linger on something slower, something softer, something that feels like drifting into sleep while listening to stories that the official records rarely whisper about. Imagine for a moment, what did it feel like to wake up in a barracks where the frost clung to the edges of the windows and the straw mattress smelled faintly of damp wool? What was it like to lace up boots that had already walked through mud, blood, and dust, carrying a body that was often more exhausted than prepared? This is not just the story of battles, but the story of being, of eating, of waiting, of writing. Letters by candlelight when the ink froze in the pen. Tonight, as the rain outside your window taps gently on the glass, or the night hum settles quietly beyond your room, let me guide you through that life, not with urgency, but with softness, as though each memory were a blanket being unfolded slowly across your mind. So before we begin, let me gently invite you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to this channel, because these histories are not the noisy ones of textbooks, but the calm ones, the sleeping ones, the ones meant to rest beside you like a friend whispering stories while you drift off. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps from a warm bed in Karachi or Lahore, perhaps from a small town in Europe, or from somewhere across the oceans in America. No matter where you are, let the atmosphere carry you. Close your eyes if you wish. Feel the quiet room around you. Imagine a faint light, perhaps from a lantern, filling the space with a soft golden glow, and the sound of boots shuffling on a wooden floor as a soldier, no older than 20, prepares himself for a day that history will later name, but he, in that moment, knows only as another dawn he must survive. He smells the coffee substitute brewing, bitter and thin, made from roasted barley instead of beans. He feels the scratch of wool against his neck, the same uniform he has worn for weeks without the chance to wash it properly. He hears the distant crackle of a radio playing orders, announcements, sometimes even music, a tune that seems almost cruel because it reminds him of a life before uniforms, before war, before the world fractured into lines drawn by power. His breath rises in the cold air, visible in the half-darkness, and he wonders whether this day will be one of fighting or simply one of waiting. And this is where our story begins, in the quiet routines of a German soldier, in the moments between. History's headlines, in the fragile spaces where fear, hope, boredom, and memory lived side by side. Because to understand what it was like to be such a soldier, you must feel the stillness of those mornings, the way the mind wandered to home, to family, to the softest things, even while surrounded by the hardest of realities. And so, as you sink deeper into your pillow, let us step together into his world, not rushing, not judging, but observing, breathing, noticing every small detail that history often forgets, and in doing so, finding the strange, quiet truths of what it really meant to be there. The days of a German soldier often unfolded not as great, sweeping dramas, but as long stretches of monotony, interrupted by sudden bursts of fear. And it was this contrast, the slow passing hours and the jarring chaos, that shaped their inner world. Imagine a barracks or dugout where time seemed to thicken like fog, where men sat in circles cleaning rifles they already cleaned yesterday, writing letters that would not be delivered for weeks, or simply staring into the grain of wooden walls, as if searching for answers hidden in the knots of the wood. The food arrived in tin bowls, sometimes steaming and hearty in appearance, but thin in substance. Cabbage soup with more water than vegetable, a crust of bread so hard it could scratch the roof of the mouth, or the occasional sausage that carried with it the smell of smoke and fat, reminding the men of home kitchens they had left behind. Eating was done quickly, often in silence, because every man was both hungry and weary, and words were not always the comfort they seemed to be. Sometimes the soldiers tried to laugh, to share a crude joke about the absurdity of army life. The endless drills, the bizarre orders, the boots that seemed to shrink in the rain and expand in the heat. But even the laughter often trailed into silence, as though joy itself was shy in such surroundings. Yet inside this silence, strange rituals grew, little ways the men made meaning out of the waiting. One would carve shapes into his rifle stock, another would braid cord into patterns, another would hum the same folk tune his mother once sang, while scrubbing laundry, letting the sound carry him back into a world that felt impossibly distant. And then there were the letters, folded and unfolded until the edges wore away, the handwriting fading under the oils of fingertips, each word from home becoming like a prayer, something to be read slowly at night when the lanterns burned low and shadows stretched across walls. The reality of being a German soldier was not always the violence we associate with war, but the constant company of waiting, waiting for orders, waiting for rations, waiting for the war to move or end, or simply pass them by. Their days could be filled with drills that repeated until they blurred into dreamlike repetition, marching in formation over the same patch of dirt until the path itself seemed weary, polishing boots until their fingers were sore, folding and unfolding blankets with precision, as if neatness could replace safety. Yet inside this rigid structure, tiny sparks of individuality flickered. One soldier hiding a piece of chocolate wrapped carefully in a sock, another sketching with charcoal on scraps of paper, another carrying a small religious charm, worn smooth by thumb and forefinger, as though it alone could bend fate in his favor. What many do not realize is how much of a soldier's life in that war was governed by improvisation. When socks wore out, they stuffed straw inside boots for warmth. When the cold stiffened fingers, they held hands over a candle flame until skin blistered. When hunger clawed, they traded buttons or scraps of soap with villagers in exchange for a potato or a handful of grain. And in the darker stretches of time, when battles loomed near, the soldiers found their dreams changed. Sleep brought not rest, but images of fire and loss. Yet they clung to sleep anyway, because it was the only escape from the endless grind of daylight duties. To be a German soldier was to live in a world where history's great battles were always whispered on the horizon. But daily life was mostly about endurance, about the 1,000 tiny acts that kept the body alive and the spirit from collapsing. And it is in these small acts that the true humanity of their experience can be found. A man laughing at the way steam curls from a tin of soup, another adjusting a comrade's collar before inspection, another writing a final line on a letter he knows may never reach its destination. All of these are pieces of what it was like Not the grand proclamations of leaders, but the fragile survival of the ordinary men caught in the machinery of war. And as you rest now, listening in the calm of your own night, imagine how strange it must have felt for them. To live in constant uncertainty, to never know if tomorrow would bring battle or boredom, glory or grief, and yet to carry on anyway. One small step at a time, as though time itself was both enemy and companion. And perhaps the real question, the one that lingers softly at the edge of sleep, is this: what did those men hold on to most tightly in such a life? Was it loyalty? Was it hope? Was it habit? Or was it simply the stubborn rhythm of breathing, one inhale and one exhale at a time, waiting for the war to finally pass them by? Life at the front for a German soldier carried a rhythm that was neither wholly alive nor entirely dead, but something in between, a suspended state where the days blurred into one another, stitched together by the sound of boots on frozen soil, the hiss of distant artillery, and the faint rustle of wind through trees stripped bare of leaves. Imagine stepping out of a trench just as dawn begins to bleed pale gray across the horizon, the earth damp and heavy, smelling of rust and mud, the boards of the trench walls slick with slime, and above it all, the silence of anticipation, broken only by the cough of a comrade or the faint drip of water collecting in the corners. The soldier's uniform clings to his body with a chill that no blanket can ease, and when he lifts his rifle, the metal bites against his hands as though the cold itself has sharpened its teeth. Meals at the front are no grand relief either. A tin of canned meat shared between four, a few boiled potatoes when supply lines hold, sometimes only dry bread soft in thin broth, swallowed quickly because the rumble of artillery could begin again at any moment. And yet within this bleakness, there are moments that seem almost absurd in their tenderness. A soldier pulling out a harmonica and playing a tune, so fragile it seems out of place in a world of fire. Another lighting a cigarette for his friend, with hands that shake too much to manage a match. Another scratching the date into the mud wall, as if reminding himself that time has not stopped entirely. Even letters from home change at the front. They arrive smudged, sometimes weeks late, carrying the smell of kitchens and fields, a whiff of soap, or the faint perfume of a lover. And men hold them to their faces, as though breathing in the life of a world far from gunpowder. But sleep is never easy in this place. When darkness falls and men lie back against packs or stretch on planks, the night carries its own ghosts. The creak of shifting earth, the occasional rat scuttling across boots, the whistle of shells somewhere too close, and dreams that replay yesterday's attack in loops until the sleeper wakes drenched in sweat, clutching at reality as if it too might slip away. To be a German soldier at the front was to exist in a contradiction, surrounded by comrades and yet profoundly alone, ordered to fight for a cause that some did not fully understand, forced to endure not just the enemy's fire, but the endless monotony of waiting for the enemy to act. And there were strange details, almost forgotten by history. Men warming hands on the barrel of a recently fired machine gun, others tying bits of cloth around their boots to quiet the sound of footsteps, still others collecting shell fragments as if they were souvenirs of survival. Humor still tried to find its way in. A soldier nicknaming the lice that infested his collar, another joking that the soup was so thin it could pass through a sieve without slowing, another teasing a comrade for snoring loud enough to wake the dead. These laughs were small, fragile, yet they mattered, because they reminded men that they were still human in a place designed to strip humanity away. And beyond the humor lay the darker truths, whispered softly, because to say them too loudly was to risk breaking the fragile thread of endurance. The despair when friends did not return, the weight of orders that sent men forward into fire, the hollow look in the eyes of those who had seen too much too quickly. Yet through it all, the soldier marched, wrote, smoked, waited, fought, and somehow lived, caught in a loop that felt eternal, even though history would one day call it finite. As you listen now, perhaps already drifting toward the edge of sleep, imagine this contradiction. A soldier standing in the mud, feeling both trapped and invisible, fighting a war larger than himself, yet still clinging to the smallest rituals. A button polished, a song hummed, a date scratched on a wall. Because sometimes survival is not about courage in the face of fire, but about noticing the tiniest details that remind you the world, however broken, is still there. And perhaps you wonder, as they did, what would tomorrow bring? Would it be another long day of waiting in cold silence, or the sudden thunder of an attack that tore silence apart? That question, unanswered, is what kept men awake even in exhaustion, and it is what leads us softly into the next part of this story. Winter, more than bullets or bombs, was often the true enemy of the German soldier, and the memories of those seasons at the front cling to accounts like frost to windows, silent, invisible, but impossible to ignore. Imagine standing guard in temperatures so severe that breath turned instantly to crystals in the air, and boots froze stiff to the ground if a man stood too long in one place. Fingers grew so numb that even holding a rifle felt like grasping at glass, and every breath cut the throat like shards of ice. To keep warm, soldiers layered whatever scraps they could find, rags tied under uniforms, newspapers stuffed inside coats, straw crammed into boots, and still the cold slipped through every barrier, curling into bones until joints ached as though they belonged to old men rather than boys barely 20 years old. Fires were rare luxuries. The smoke could betray their position, and so often the men huddled together in dugouts, body heat their only defense, the smell of unwashed wool and damp earth filling the air, the sound of teeth chattering forming an odd rhythm in the dark. Food, already meager, became a crueler joke in such cold. Tins of meat so stiff they had to be thawed over candle flames, bread frozen into bricks that had to be hacked apart with bayonets, thin soups that cooled into slush before they could be swallowed. And yet, even in this bleakness, strange rituals arose. Men sang to themselves in whispers to keep spirits alive. Others swore that rubbing snow into their faces would prevent frostbite, while a few carved tiny wooden charms from branches, believing that a scrap of luck could warm the heart even when the body shook with cold. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and filled with dreams of heat. Ovens, fireplaces, steaming cups of coffee, kitchens where mothers stirred pots of stew, only for men to wake to reality, another dawn in a world of ice. But there were also moments of absurd humor, as though laughter itself refused to surrender. One soldier joked that the lice infesting his seams must be freezing too. Another claimed the icicles on his mustache made him look like an old general, and sometimes, when one man's boots squeaked against the frozen earth, others teased him that he was marching in time to invisible music. Beneath these small comforts, however, the darkness was never far. Frostbite stole toes and fingers, illness spread quickly through crowded shelters, and despair gnawed silently at the edges of thought, whispering questions that could not be asked aloud. How long could a man endure this? Did he still believe in the cause, or only in survival itself? Letters from home became lifelines, even when they carried reminders of scarcity. Wives writing of rationing, mothers describing empty shelves, children scribbling pictures of houses that no longer stood. These words kept men tethered to something beyond the trench, though they also deepened the ache of longing. What history often forgets is the strange combination of endurance and superstition that thrived in these winters. Men refusing to shave before battle, believing the beard offered luck. Others carrying a coin or a button from a first uniform as though it could shield them from death. Still others whispering to photographs before sleep, convinced the faces of loved ones could guard them in the night. And so the soldier survived, not with grand victories, but with the smallest of tricks: a scrap of cloth, a candle flame, a whispered joke, a stubborn refusal to surrender breath, even when every bone urged him to stop. To be a German soldier in winter was to live in contradiction, to be frozen and alive, despairing and yet stubbornly enduring. And as you rest now, perhaps warm beneath your own blanket, you can almost sense the strangeness of that existence. A man clutching his rifle under a sky swollen with snow, wondering if tomorrow would bring battle, or simply another day of frost, waiting for something he could not name. And the question that hung over them, soft but heavy, was this: how do you hold on to your humanity when even the weather seems determined to strip it away? That is what leads us deeper into the next part of this story, where we glimpse the hidden superstitions, coping rituals, and strange fragments of hope that kept men breathing when the world itself seemed frozen against them. Beyond the cold and the hunger, another unseen companion lived with the German soldier: superstition, ritual, and the strange habits that gave men a fragile sense of control in a world where control had been stripped from them. Every army throughout history has carried its charms and omens, but in the Second World War, these small rituals seemed to multiply in the shadows of the trenches and frozen forests. A soldier might carry a coin given to him by a lover, rubbing its worn surface before battle, as though it could deflect bullets. Another might whisper the same short prayer every time he loaded his rifle, a prayer so quietly repeated that it became like breathing. Another would refuse to button the top, clasp of his tunic before combat, swearing that it would bring him bad luck. Some drew chalk marks on their helmets, others tied scraps of colored cloth around their wrists, and still others kept locks of hair tucked into pockets, fragments of home turned into talismans against death. These superstitions were not always private. Men shared them, compared them, teased each other for them, and yet in the teasing was a kind of respect, because everyone knew that in war, even the smallest belief might be the thin thread that kept despair away. The days themselves became rituals. The morning roll call where boots stamped in rhythm against the earth, the cleaning of weapons repeated with obsessive care, the ration line where men shuffled forward with their mess tins like a slow procession. In a church of survival, at night, some soldiers swore they heard voices in the wind, whispers carried across no man's land that they insisted belonged to spirits of the fallen, warning them or urging them to stay awake. Others lit candles, not just for light, but for protection, staring into the small flames as though they contained secret messages from a world beyond reach. Humor, too, became ritual. The same jokes told night after night, about the soup, about the lice, about the officers who never seemed to understand what the front was really like. Jokes that grew familiar enough to feel like prayers in their own right, repeated until they lost their edge and became strangely soothing. But within this odd theater of charms and habits lay the darker current of reality. Men who believed in luck still fell. Men who prayed still froze. And men who clutched talismans still bled into the same soil. And yet the rituals continued, because they were not about changing fate so much as about surviving the present moment, about convincing the heart to beat one more time, about giving the mind something to cling to in a place where everything else was slipping away. And still, even with their rituals, German soldiers often found themselves staring at the night sky, watching stars blur behind smoke, wondering if anything above them noticed their tiny gestures below. Sleepers murmured in their dreams, clutching amulets, muttering words from childhood prayers, while beside them comrades did the same in silence, each man fighting his own invisible battle against fear. Perhaps what these superstitions reveal is that beneath the steel helmet and the rifle, the soldier was still simply human, longing for assurance, for order, for a whisper that he might survive tomorrow. And as you rest now, listening, you can Imagine how strange it felt to fight in one of history's largest wars, and yet to feel that survival might rest not only on strategy or strength, but on whether a small ritual, a lucky charm, or a whispered phrase might tilt the scales of fate. The hook that lingers, pulling us into the next part, is this. How did these fragile rituals hold up when the war pressed harder, when battles grew fiercer, when the machinery of destruction swallowed whole divisions? Could a coin, a prayer, or a joke still protect a man? Or did belief itself become the final battlefield? If the waiting and the rituals shaped much of a German soldier's existence, then the sudden eruption of combat was the moment when everything they had rehearsed, feared, and quietly resisted collided with reality, and no ritual, no charm, no superstition could fully shield them from its weight. Imagine the stillness of dawn shattered by the scream of artillery shells, the ground trembling as though the earth itself was breaking apart, and men hurling themselves flat into mud that sprayed into eyes and mouths, turning breath into choking. Gasps. In those moments, time no longer obeyed ordinary rules. Seconds stretched like hours, and hours could vanish in an instant, swallowed by fire and smoke. A soldier gripping his rifle would feel it not as a weapon, but as an anchor, something solid in a world that suddenly melted into chaos. The soundscape was unbearable, the thunder of cannons, the staccato of machine guns rattling endlessly, the whistle of shells overhead, and between it all, the shouts, orders barked, names screamed, prayers muttered, cries for medics rising and vanishing into the storm. And yet, even in this storm, odd fragments of humanity clung to the edges. Soldiers ducking together into shell craters would share a glance, a grim smile, sometimes even a joke. At least we have a roof over our heads now. Gallows. Humor that turned terror into something just a fraction lighter. Some described the taste of battle as metallic, the air thick with cordite and iron. Others said it was like breathing through cloth soaked in fire. Feet slid on blood-slick mud. Boots pulled free of muck, with sucking sounds that felt obscene. Hands shook as men reloaded rifles again and again until the motions blurred into instinct. And always, the fear. Not the dramatic fear of novels, but the quiet, constant tremor in the stomach. The knowledge that survival depended as much on randomness as on skill. Many soldiers later admitted that in the middle of combat, thought itself often disappeared. They moved like shadows, reacting more than deciding, their world reduced to the narrow scope of their rifle sights or the next 10 steps forward. The irony was that after days or weeks of waiting, battles often lasted minutes, sometimes hours, and then collapsed back into silence as abruptly as they had begun. Survivors crawled out of the smoke, ears ringing, eyes stinging, bodies trembling. Not just from exertion, but from the surreal realization of still being alive. Some soldiers laughed hysterically, unable to stop. Others wept quietly, hiding their faces in the crook of their arms. Others sat completely still, staring at nothing as though their souls had briefly stepped away. And then, almost cruelly, life resumed its routine. Rifles cleaned, boots wiped, rations distributed, roll calls taken. History remembers the battles, names of towns captured or lost, rivers crossed, offensives launched. But for the soldier, what lingered was the strange, emotional whiplash, the way terror could consume them one moment and boredom cradle them the next. There were details so small, yet unforgettable. The smell of singed hair when helmets heated from nearby explosions, the sight of birds returning almost immediately after a barrage, as though nature itself refused to pause for war, the absurd comedy of a soldier tripping in mud and swearing loudly only to make his comrades laugh through their exhaustion. And through it all, the deeper truth remained. Soldiers fought not only because they were ordered to, but because survival demanded action. To move, to shoot, to endure, even when their minds quietly questioned the meaning of it all. In the quiet that followed combat, When night fell and the fires died down, men lay awake, replaying what they had seen. The flash of a comrade's face disappearing, the sharp smell of blood mingling with gunpowder, the shock of realizing that the enemy was just another young man, terrified, caught in the same machinery. These were not things spoken of loudly. They lingered in silence, gnawed at the edges of dreams, turned into memories that never softened. To be a German soldier was to be pulled between extremes, the crushing monotony of waiting and the unbearable chaos of battle, two opposites that together formed a rhythm unlike anything in ordinary life. And perhaps what is most haunting is this. After each clash, after each storm of fire, men returned to their rituals, their jokes, their letters, as though patching themselves back into humanity, piece by piece. For as much as war sought to turn them into machines, they remained painfully human, clinging to the smallest signs that life continued. And so, as you sink deeper into rest now, you might feel the weight of that contradiction pressing softly against your thoughts. The soldier, caught between silence and storm, asking not only if he would survive, but if he could survive and remain himself. Which leads us gently into the next part of the story. How men learned to carry the aftermath, to live with the echoes of battle long after the guns went quiet, and how memory itself became both burden and fragile shield in the nights that followed. After the smoke cleared and the battlefield fell silent, the German soldier faced another kind of struggle, not the roar of artillery or the rush of advancing lines, but the long, heavy aftermath that clung to body and mind like an invisible weight. The hours after combat were often the most difficult, because in the stillness, every sound, smell, and memory returned with startling clarity. Men sat slumped against walls or lay stretched out in dugouts, their faces hollow, uniforms streaked. With mud and blood, fingers trembling even when holding nothing at all. They cleaned rifles in silence, wiping down barrels that still smelled of smoke, and the sound of cloth against metal became a kind of lullaby, soft and steady, almost mechanical, as though pretending to focus on the weapon could keep the mind from replaying what the eyes had seen. Some soldiers filled the silence with cigarettes, one after another, the smoke curling upward into stale air, as though the act of inhaling and exhaling could push away the images that kept returning, the face of a fallen comrade, the flash of a shell, the echo of screams that had already faded from the battlefield, but not from memory. Others turned to letters, writing with a desperation that revealed itself in hurried handwriting, as if they needed to capture words before sleep overtook them, or before their courage dissolved. But what did they write? Rarely the truth. Letters were softened, scrubbed clean of horror, dressed in the plain clothes of routine. I am well. The food is enough. I think often of home. And yet, between the lines, what they longed to say was heavier, unspoken, that they felt older than their years, that sleep no longer brought peace, that sometimes they wondered whether they would ever see the world beyond trenches and barracks. Again, in the quiet hours, coping took strange forms. One soldier might hum the same lullaby his mother sang to him as a child, letting the sound fold around him like a blanket. Another carved shapes into wood with a pocket knife. Not elaborate, just lines and patterns, as though repeating the same cuts might untangle the chaos inside. Others made up small games, tossing pebbles into helmets, betting who could hit. The most with eyes closed, anything to break the silence that threatened to suffocate. Humor returned here too, fragile but stubborn. Jokes about lice armies larger than the enemy's. Jokes about boots that seemed determined to walk off without their owners. Jokes about soup so thin that it could slip through a man's teeth unnoticed. And though the laughter was tired, sometimes hollow, it mattered because it reminded the men that the war had not completely claimed their humanity. Still, there was no escaping the darker side of the aftermath. Night after battle was restless. Men turned in their sleep, muttered, clutched at blankets as though reaching for weapons, woke suddenly with eyes wide and hands shaking. Some spoke to themselves in the dark, whispering names, prayers, fragments of sentences that made sense. Only to them. The body might rest, but the mind kept marching, replaying the chaos again and again. It was in these nights that superstition and ritual became strongest. Candles lit, charms held tight, words whispered over and over, until exhaustion finally carried them into uneasy dreams. And beyond the trenches, in occupied villages or temporary quarters, aftermath wore another face. Soldiers entered homes abandoned or half-destroyed, sat at tables still holding traces of family life, chipped cups, faded photographs, curtains swaying in broken windows. And these sights sometimes pierced deeper than the battle itself, because they reminded men of what war is. Some took objects as keepsakes, small items slipped into pockets not out of greed, but as a way to hold on to something ordinary, something human, amid the inhumanity. Others refused to touch anything, as though leaving the space untouched was its own form of respect. And always the question lingered, how much of oneself could survive this repetition of chaos and silence, storm, and aftermath? What kind of man emerged from such a rhythm? Perhaps that is why soldiers clung so fiercely to the smallest rituals, the jokes, the charms, the letters, because these were the threads that held them together, fragile but unbroken. To be a German soldier in the aftermath of battle was to live in a twilight space, neither fully in the world of the living nor fully surrendered to despair, but hovering between, surviving one day at a time. And as you lie here listening, perhaps already drifting toward sleep, you can sense that weight too. The silence after noise, the memory that lingers longer than the moment, the fragile breath that carries a man from one day into the next. And this is what leads us onward, into the next part of the story. How soldiers learn to carry these invisible burdens, not just in trenches but in marshes, in winter retreats, in endless campaigns that stretched far beyond what any of them had imagined, when endurance itself became both weapon and wound. If the trench was a prison of stillness, then the march was its opposite, an endless test of movement, of legs carrying men farther than their minds thought possible, through landscapes that blurred together into a single memory of mud, dust, snow, and hunger. German soldiers spent an astonishing amount of their war not in dramatic battles, but in walking toward the front, walking away from it, walking through villages that seemed emptied of life, walking across fields where crops had been trampled into the soil, walking along roads lined with wreckage that told stories louder than any words could. The march was its own world, its own rhythm, boots striking ground in dull unison, the jangle of equipment with each step, the coughs and mutters of men trying to keep pace, and above all, the silence that stretched between them, a silence filled with private thoughts no one dared voice. A soldier's pack grew heavier with every kilometer, straps digging into shoulders until skin blistered. Rifles felt like lead across backs, helmets pressed down like weights, and the body itself became a machine, one step, then another, until thought narrowed to nothing but survival of the stride. Rations on the road were scarce. Men chewed stale bread as they walked, sucked on pebbles to ease thirst, or passed around tins of sardines, eating with fingers because spoons were buried too deep in packs. Some soldiers traded with villagers, offering buttons, soap, or even cigarette butts in exchange for a handful of apples or potatoes, the taste of which felt like feasts in comparison to army food. Fatigue shaped the march more than any enemy. Blisters burst, toenails blackened and fell away, legs stiffened until every bend of the knee felt like fire, and yet men kept going, driven not by belief in cause, but by the relentless momentum of the column. because to stop was to be left behind, and to be left behind was unthinkable. Strange habits grew along the road, men muttering numbers under their breath to count steps, others singing softly to themselves, some inventing chants that turned miles into verses, as if rhythm could disguise exhaustion. Humor crept in here, as well, fragile but persistent. Jokes about boots that must have been made of stone, jokes about officers riding horses while men stumbled under packs, jokes about the army being less about fighting and more about endless parades across broken lands. Yet under the humor, darkness remained. Men collapsed mid-step and had to be lifted back into line. Others walked with fevers burning in their bodies, sweat freezing against skin, eyes glassy, but feet still moving because stopping meant punishment, humiliation, or worse. And the landscapes themselves etched into memory. Forests where snow muffled every sound until the march felt like a dream. Villages where women stood in doorways clutching children while soldiers passed in silence. Roads where bodies have fallen. Comrades or enemies alike lay half buried in earth, ignored because the column could not stop. Nights on the march offered little rest. Men slept sitting against trees, against each other, against walls of barns commandeered as shelter, and woke stiff, half-rested, already summoned by the call to move again. Letters written on the road carried a different tone than those from trenches, shorter, fragmented, written in haste, as if words themselves were too heavy to carry after miles of steps. Some soldiers admitted in diaries that the march broke men more than battles did. Battles ended, but march stretched on, draining body and spirit alike, until life itself felt reduced to the rhythm of boots and the weight of packs. Still, even here, small curiosities lingered. Soldiers picking wildflowers and pressing them into notebooks. Men keeping feathers, coins, or stones as lucky tokens from the road. Small souvenirs of places that blurred into anonymity. Perhaps that is the paradox of the march, that in the vast movement across landscapes, the soldier's world shrank to something painfully small. The next step, the next breath, the faint hope of a meal or rest. And as you drift deeper into your own rest now, you can almost feel the weariness of that journey, the heaviness of each step, the strange combination of monotony and survival. Which brings us quietly to the next part of this story. How soldiers, after days of marching, found themselves thrust again into the grind of frontline life, forced to carry not only their packs, but the invisible burdens of exhaustion, memory, and a longing for a home that grew more distant with every step. When the long marches ended and the column finally slowed, the German soldier often found himself not in rest, but in yet another front line, a place both new and strangely familiar. As though war repeated itself in different landscapes, changing only the scenery while leaving the rhythm of survival untouched. Arriving at a new position meant first the scramble of preparation, digging fresh trenches or reinforcing old ones, stacking sandbags, building shelters from planks, earth, and whatever materials could be scavenged, sometimes even pulling beams from ruined houses to shore up dugouts against collapse. The smell of freshly turned soil clung to uniforms, mixing with the lingering odor of sweat and smoke from the march. And men set about their work with a weary silence, each shovel of dirt. A reminder that no matter where the war moved, the soldier's life remained tied to earth, to digging into it, hiding within it, sleeping upon it. New landscapes carried their own moods. In forests, the air was heavy with pine, needles crunching underfoot as soldiers strung barbed wire between trees. In villages, the cracked walls of abandoned homes became backdrops for sentries, with curtains fluttering from broken windows as though waving farewell. In fields, the open horizon left men feeling exposed, every movement watched by an invisible enemy somewhere beyond sight. Soldiers quickly learned to adapt, turning unfamiliar spaces into temporary homes. A dugout wall might be decorated with a scrap of newspaper, pinned like wallpaper, a shelf carved into clay to hold a tin cup, or even a small photograph stuck into the mud with a nail. Some men sketched crude graffiti, drawings of women, jokes about officers, caricatures of comrades, reminders that even in war, the urge to leave a mark did not vanish. At night, the front line shifted into another world. Lanterns flickered dimly, voices dropped to whispers, and the sounds of the enemy drifted across the silence. Coughs, clinks of tools, sometimes even snatches of conversation carried by wind. It was unnerving to lie in a trench and hear an enemy soldier humming a tune only a few hundred meters away, to realize that both sides lived parallel lives, building, waiting, enduring. Meals were little better than those on the road. Thin soups, ladled from field kitchens, black bread, ersatz coffee, brewed from roasted grains, all eaten in haste, the clatter of spoons against tins echoing in narrow spaces. Yet even here, humor found cracks to bloom through. Jokes about cooks being the real enemy. Jokes about coffee so weak, it was really just hot hope. Jokes about the lice enjoying better meals than the soldiers themselves. Beneath the humor, however, lay the quiet weight of fear. For a new front meant new dangers. Unfamiliar terrain, mines hidden underfoot, artillery already mapped against their positions, and the constant tension of not knowing when the first shot would break. The fragile silence. Soldiers lay awake, listening to the faint scratching of rats, the distant hum of planes, the creak of wood shifting in dugouts, every sound amplified by nerves stretched taut. Letters from home carried even more meaning in these moments, unfolding. In the flicker of candlelight, read again and again until words blurred, the handwriting memorized, the paper folded and unfolded until it tore at the creases. The creases. Some men confessed to carrying letters close to their hearts, tucked inside tunics, as though paper could act as armor. Diaries reveal strange details too. Soldiers describing the smell of wet earth, the way frost painted trench walls with crystals. Like lace, the odd comfort of hearing church bells in a nearby village despite the war raging around them. These small sensory notes remind us that life at the front was not just about fighting, but about noticing the smallest fragments of normalcy amid destruction. Yet the darker truths never left. Comrades disappearing during night patrols, sudden. Shell fire ripping apart hours of silence. Rumors of offensives spreading like shadows through the ranks. And in the stillness between, soldiers wrestled with questions they rarely voiced aloud. How many more fronts would there be? Would home ever feel real again after this? Was survival luck, skill, or something neither could touch? To be a German soldier in such a place was to live in cycles, march, dig, wait, fight, survive, repeat. A loop that hollowed the days yet filled the mind with unshakable memories. And as you rest now, you can almost sense the rhythm yourself. The soldier setting down his pack at a new trench, stretching sore legs, breathing in the damp air of unfamiliar soil, already preparing for the same grind in a new place. And this leads us, quietly but surely, into the next part of the story. How men learned to carry these repetitions. How survival became not just about food and shelter, but about finding meaning, or inventing it, in the endless cycles of war that seemed to have no end dot inside the front lines. Where silence stretched long between bursts of fire, German soldiers found themselves constructing a fragile imitation of ordinary life, weaving fragments of routine into the fabric of war as though to remind themselves that they were still human. The trench, crude and muddy, often became a stage for strange domesticity. One man carving shells into earthen walls to hold his cup and spoon, another arranging pebbles into neat rows as though decorating a garden, another pinning a scrap of cloth into the roof beams to create something like a curtain. Soldiers brewed ersatz coffee in tin cans balanced over candles, its bitter smell drifting through the dugout, mingling with the scent of damp wool and tobacco. Cigarettes, endlessly traded and shared, became currency and comfort both, passed around in silence or lit with the glow of a single match that briefly illuminated weary faces. In these quiet hours, games emerged. Dice carved from wood, cards sketched by hand on scraps of cardboard, contests of who could throw pebbles closest to a mark in the mud. The laughter that followed was soft, subdued, but it was laughter all the same, a sound that softened the weight of waiting. Soldiers sang too, voices low, sometimes choruses of folk songs remembered from childhood, sometimes parodies of military marches, turning solemn tunes into clumsy jokes that made men smile even as their breath rose like smoke into the cold night. Letters from home were read aloud in parts, shared as if words of wives, mothers, or sweethearts belonged to all of them, not just to the man who received them. There were rituals of grooming, shaving with cold water, polishing boots, combing hair with fingers, not because there was vanity, but because each gesture reminded the soldier that he was still a man, not merely a cog in the machinery of war. Food, meager as it was, sometimes became a communal ritual. Men splitting sausages into smaller pieces so that everyone could taste, stirring soup together, stretching crumbs of bread into makeshift puddings with sugar if they could find it. Strange humor bloomed here as well. Jokes about lice holding rank, jokes about officers whose shoes were cleaner than their souls, jokes about the soup being strong enough to stand a spoon upright only if the spoon was nailed to the table. Beneath the humor, however, was the unspoken knowledge that this normality was a fragile shell, cracked easily by a sudden shell burst, an unexpected order, or the news that comrades had not returned from a night patrol. And yet, soldiers clung to these fragments because they gave shape to days that otherwise dissolved into mud and silence. Diaries record details that seem trivial but reveal much. The way a man took pride in sweeping dirt from his dugout floor with a bundle of twigs. The joy of finding a cat in a ruined village and feeding it scraps. The comfort of hearing someone whistle a tune while mending socks. These were survival mechanisms as vital as rations or ammunition, because they guarded the soldier's sense of self. In a war that tried to turn men into numbers, into faceless masses moving at the command of strategy, these small gestures were acts of quiet rebellion, affirmations that life still pulsed beneath the uniform. And as night deepened, soldiers lay back on straw or planks, staring at the dugout ceiling, listening to the distant rumble of artillery like thunder beyond mountains. And in that twilight space between wakefulness and sleep, they might imagine themselves home, sitting at a table, walking through a field, holding the hand of someone they loved. These images, soft and fleeting, were the true fuel of survival, more sustaining than the thin soups or the scraps of bread. And perhaps that is the deeper truth. To be a German soldier was not only to endure, but to constantly invent ways of remembering life inside death, of building small islands of humanity in seas of destruction. As you sink deeper into your pillow, now you can almost hear those soft songs, those murmured jokes, those echoes of ordinary life pressed against extraordinary darkness. And this leads us gently onward into the next part of the story, where we glimpse how soldiers faced not only the grind of daily survival, but the crushing weight of longing, the ache of separation from home, and the strange ways distance reshaped their very sense of self. If there was one thread that stitched itself through every German soldier's experience, it was longing, the ache for home, for family, for the rhythms of life that had once seemed ordinary, but now glowed in memory with a kind of impossible perfection. Letters were the lifelines, fragile pieces of paper carried through mud, smoke, and distance, folded and unfolded until the ink blurred and the creases tore. To receive a letter was to feel, for a brief moment, that the war had cracks through which sunlight could slip. Men read them slowly, lips moving silently over familiar handwriting, savoring every detail, the mention of weather back home, the description of a child's new habit, the gossip of neighbors, the recipe of a cake never to be baked at the front. Some soldiers carried letters in their breast pockets, close to the heart, so that even in battle, the words of wives, mothers, or sweethearts pressed physically against their skin. Others copied favorite lines into notebooks, repeating them like prayers in the quiet before sleep. The absence of letters, however, gnawed like hunger. Days without post-delivery were heavy, and rumors spread quickly. Perhaps supply lines were broken. Perhaps the censors had removed something. Perhaps something had happened at home that could not be written. This silence became its own torment, one that soldiers tried to fill with imagination, picturing the faces of loved ones, the sound of a child's laugh, the smell of bread baking, all conjured in the mind with such clarity that it hurt to wake from those visions into the cold dampness of a dugout. Homesickness showed itself in strange ways. Men collecting wildflowers and pressing them into notebooks as though they could preserve a piece of beauty to send back. Others sketching villages they passed, drawing houses with windows alight, imagining them as their own. Still others speaking often of food, bread with butter, sausages fresh from the pan, beer foaming in mugs, apples plucked from trees, the kind of details that made their mouths water and their eyes sting at the same time. Humor, too, leaned toward home. Men teased one another about sweethearts, about whether wives were faithful, about what meals they would demand when the war ended. Yet even in laughter, there was an undertone of sadness, because everyone knew that home had become a kind of dream, not unreachable, but so distant that to touch it again felt uncertain. Diaries reveal small gestures of yearning. A soldier drawing hearts in the margins of a notebook, another carrying a ribbon tied around his wrist, a keepsake from a girl, another humming lullabies his mother once sang. These were fragile rituals, but they carried men through the emptiest nights. And there were darker truths as well. Men who returned from leave spoke of how strange home felt, how they no longer fit into quiet streets or peaceful kitchens, how the distance had reshaped them so thoroughly that even the comfort they longed for now felt alien. Others feared that by the time they returned, nothing would remain. Houses destroyed, families scattered, relationships lost to time. Yet still they hoped, because hope was the only currency stronger than rations or ammunition. To be a German soldier in this world was to carry home not in the body, but in the imagination, to survive by replaying memories and creating futures inside the mind, even while the present offered only mud and silence. And as you rest now, perhaps, holding your own memories close, you can feel how powerful longing can be, how it shapes survival, how it becomes both wound and balm. This is what guides us into the next part of the story. How longing did not always stay soft, but sometimes hardened into despair, into questions about meaning, about survival itself, and about whether there was truly a way back home at all. Home at all. If homesickness was the thread that bound soldiers to life beyond the front, despair was the shadow that threatened to sever it, creeping quietly into dugouts and marshes, into sleepless nights and endless days, until men began to feel as though the war was not only outside them, but inside their bones. For many German soldiers, the weight of longing sometimes tipped into something darker, a sense of futility that whispered in the quiet hours. What if this war never ended? What if home had already slipped away, lost to time, to destruction, to the silent drift of change? In diaries, men wrote of nights where laughter no longer came, where even the comfort of letters felt thin, unable to bridge the gap between memory and the brutal now. Some confessed to staring at photographs of wives or sweethearts until the faces blurred, as if their own minds no longer believed such people existed. Others admitted to moments of strange detachment, watching comrades eat, smoke, or play games, and feeling as though they themselves were ghosts, present but not entirely alive. The army rarely tolerated visible cracks. Weakness was hidden behind forced smiles, behind routines performed with mechanical precision. Yet in private, despair leaked out in unusual ways. Soldiers tearing pages from letters in frustration, others drinking down their rations of schnapps too quickly, coughing and laughing bitterly, as though burning away more than just alcohol. Still others scribbling prayers or poems onto trench walls, only to scratch them out again, ashamed of what they revealed. Humor itself sometimes turned dark, twisted, almost surreal. Jokes about lice being the only true victors. Jokes about boots walking home on their own. Jokes about the war lasting long enough for them to grow beards down to their boots. These were not jokes of joy but of resignation, a way to soften truths too heavy to say plainly. And still, men clung to small rituals, even in despair. A soldier who no longer wrote letters might still fold a scrap of paper into the shape of a bird, pinning it to the dugout wall. Another might polish his rifle each night, not with belief but with stubbornness, a refusal to let go of routine. Even when faith was gone, some turned inward, finding strange solace in silence, staring at the flicker of a candle until hours passed. Others watching snowfall or rain, as though nature's rhythms were more reliable than human promises. There were darker stories too. Soldiers who deserted, unable to carry the weight, who were caught and punished harshly, their fates whispered in the ranks as both warning and quiet sympathy. Some men turned their despair into letters filled with veiled confessions, words that seemed plain on the surface, but between the lines revealed how close they stood to breaking. And yet, for every soldier swallowed by despair, others endured by reshaping it, turning hopelessness into stubborn survival, telling themselves that even if meaning had vanished, the act of breathing, of walking, of enduring one more day, was reason enough. This strange resilience fascinated historians later, because it showed how men could live in contradiction, hopeless and hopeful at once, despairing and yet unwilling to surrender entirely. And perhaps this was the essence of being a soldier in that war. Not heroism, not belief, but the quiet persistence of bodies and minds, refusing to collapse completely. As you listen now, sinking deeper into calm, you can almost feel that fragile balance, the way despair hovered like fog, but never fully suffocated the flame of survival. And it is this fragile balance that leads us into the next part of the story. How, in the midst of despair, soldiers sometimes found unexpected moments of beauty in nature, in comradeship, in fleeting gestures, as though the world itself offered small reminders that life, however faint, still insisted on being lived. Amid the weight of despair and the endless grind of war, there were still moments, brief, fragile, almost accidental, when beauty pressed itself into the lives of German soldiers, surprising them like sunlight breaking through a storm. And it was in these moments that many found just enough strength to carry on. Nature, indifferent to human battles, often offered these glimpses. The sudden call of a bird after hours of silence, the way snow fell so softly it seemed to erase the scars of trenches, the golden haze of evening light across a ruined field. Soldiers noticed these details with an intensity sharpened by deprivation. A patch of blue sky became a painting. A blade of grass pushing through mud became a miracle. The sight of stars above the dugout roof became proof that the universe was still vast and not entirely consumed by gunfire. Diaries describe such scenes with surprising tenderness. One man wrote of sitting at the edge of a trench and watching frost glitter like diamonds on the wire. Another described pausing mid-march to admire a field of sunflowers swaying in the wind. Another remembered hearing church bells from a distant village and feeling tears well up, not from sadness, but from the reminder that life outside war still rang. Comradeship, too, became a form of beauty, subtle and unspoken. A soldier sharing the last bit of his bread with another, one man offering his cigarette to calm trembling hands, another quietly sewing a rip in a comrade's sleeve by candlelight. These gestures, small and almost invisible, shone brighter than medals or speeches. Soldiers often joked that in the army, true wealth was measured not in pay, but in kindness. And though the joke was light, there was truth beneath it. Some men found comfort in art, even improvised, carving small figures. From wood scraps, sketching scenes of home on the backs of ration wrappers, humming tunes that turned into quiet choruses in the dark. There were stories of soldiers finding abandoned pianos in ruined houses, pressing keys that sang out cracked but beautiful notes, and for a brief hour, a dugout filled with music instead of silence. Others turned to animals for solace, feeding, stray cats, watching birds perch on wires, even laughing at the persistence of rats who seemed as immortal as the war itself. Humor, too, though fragile, softened life's edges. Jokes about lice being faithful companions, about boots that could march home without their owners, about soup so weak it should be charged for rent instead of calories. All these small bursts of laughter became bridges across despair. But perhaps the most hauntingly beautiful moments came in silence itself, sitting shoulder to shoulder with comrades, staring into firelight or into the endless sky, saying nothing and yet feeling, connected in ways no words could capture. These moments were often remembered more vividly than battles, because they reminded soldiers that life was not entirely consumed by destruction. Something tender, something stubbornly alive, persisted even here. And yet, the beauty was fleeting. It came and went like wind across fields, never lasting, always slipping away just as quickly as it arrived. That was perhaps why it mattered so much, why soldiers clung to it in memory and scribbled it into diaries, why they retold these stories even decades later, because beauty in war was not only a reprieve, but proof that their humanity had not been extinguished. And as you rest now, you might feel the echo of that contradiction. How in the darkest landscapes, the smallest lights shine brightest, how a soldier crouching in mud could still look up and whisper at the stars. This is what carries us softly into the next part of the story. How these fragile moments of beauty were tested against the relentless demands of survival, and how soldiers balanced between wonder and weariness as the war stretched on into something that seemed endless. As the war dragged on, those rare glimmers of beauty began to fade more quickly beneath the relentless demands of survival. And German soldiers once again found themselves consumed by the grind, a cycle of hunger, exhaustion, and repetition that seemed to stretch without end. Food, never plentiful, grew scarcer, and rations shrank until meals were little more than placeholders. Thin soups ladled into dented tins, bread so coarse it crumbled like sand, coffee substitutes brewed from roasted roots that carried the taste of bitterness more than warmth. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing quietly at the edges of thought, turning men into collectors of crumbs, into dreamers of kitchens that no longer existed. Some soldiers kept little caches of food hidden away, a piece of sausage wrapped carefully in cloth, a few sugar cubes tucked into a boot, a crust of bread saved for a day when despair seemed heavier than hunger. Others grew inventive, boiling weeds into broths, roasting acorns as makeshift snacks, trading buttons or soap with villagers for potatoes or eggs. Humor emerged even here, stubborn as ever. Jokes about soup being so thin it was only water remembering food. Jokes about bread that could double as building bricks. Jokes about rats being better fed than the soldiers themselves. Yet beneath the laughter, hunger carved deep lines into faces, hollowed cheeks, sharpened eyes, and made every step feel heavier than it should. Exhaustion, too, became its own enemy. pressing down on shoulders like a weight no man could shrug off. Marshes felt longer, trenches colder, dugouts darker, and sleep, even when it came, was shallow, broken by the cold or by dreams so vivid they left men more tired upon waking. Some soldiers learned to sleep anywhere, standing against a wall, sitting on packs, even mid-march with heads nodding and feet moving on instinct. Others leaned on comrades, dozing in pairs, each man's body propping the other up, survival stitched together by borrowed strength. Diaries reveal strange survival tricks. One soldier claimed he could trick himself into feeling rested by repeating a lullaby silently in his head. Another swore by chewing raw onion to wake himself during guard duty. Another admitted to counting stars until sleep claimed him, despite the cold biting at his skin. But exhaustion was more than physical. It was a slow erosion of the spirit, a draining away of hope, until men moved like shadows, repeating orders, carrying rifles, performing routines without thinking. And still, even here, soldiers reached for scraps of humanity, shaving in icy water to feel clean for a moment, mending socks with thread pulled from unraveling blankets, laughing at a comrade's crooked haircut. These gestures, small and almost absurd against the vast machinery of war, were the anchors that kept men tethered to life. Yet the darker truth was that survival is never guaranteed, no matter the rituals, no matter the humor. Comrades collapsed. From exhaustion mid-march, others succumbed to illness. Still others disappeared during night duty, swallowed by silence. Rumors spread through the ranks like smoke. Stories of divisions cut off, of retreats turned into routes, of commanders demanding more than bodies could give. Soldiers whispered their fears quietly, never too loudly, because despair spoken aloud could spread like a contagion. And so survival became an act not just of the body, but of the mind, of holding fast to the smallest routines, the smallest fragments of normality, even as the war grew larger, hungrier, more relentless. To be a German soldier in these years was to live in contradiction, to laugh while starving, to sing while trembling, to march while longing only to stop, and yet to continue anyway. And as you drift deeper now, you can feel the weight of that rhythm, the endless cycle of hunger and exhaustion, of laughter and silence, of survival pulled together by threads thinner than breath. Which leads us gently into the next part of the story. How, amid this grind, soldiers leaned ever more on comradeship, finding in one another the strength to endure what alone might have been impossible. If hunger gnawed at the body and exhaustion wore down the mind, then comradeship was the thread that kept German soldiers from unraveling completely, the invisible bond that wove men together in ways deeper than rank or uniform could explain. In the trenches, on the marshes, in the frozen forests, it was not ideology or orders that carried most men forward, but the presence of the comrade beside them, the man who shared his bread, who passed his last cigarette, who stood guard while the other stole a few minutes of rest. Soldiers often said they fought not for Germany, not even for survival, but for each other, for the small circle of men who had become closer than brothers. Diaries are filled with tender details. A soldier mending a comrade's sock by candlelight, another carrying a friend's pack when fever burned through him, another quietly pressing half of his hidden ration of sugar into another man's hand. Humor bloomed most strongly in groups, the kind of weary laughter that belonged only to men who had suffered together. They teased one another about snores, echoing louder than artillery, about lice choosing favorites, about boots that stank so badly they could drive the enemy away on their own. These jokes, crude and simple, meant more than words could express, for they reminded soldiers that even in mud, blood, and smoke, humanity could still spark like flint struck against stone. Comrades created rituals that belonged only to them, nicknames that replaced real names, songs sung off-key in dugouts, secret handshakes or gestures that became symbols of trust. Some groups invented small ceremonies. A mock toast before drinking their bitter coffee substitute. A silly award for the man who found the oddest object on the march. Even a tradition of telling a story before sleep, each man adding a line until everyone was laughing in the dark. These rituals were fragile but powerful, weaving threads of normal life into a tapestry stitched against the background of war. And when the worst came, when shells fell, when men bled into the earth, comradeship became not just comfort but salvation. Soldiers risked their lives to drag wounded friends to safety, carried one another across fields under fire, whispered encouragements into ears as though words alone could keep breath alive. Many later admitted that what they remembered most vividly was not battles or victories, but the faces of comrades, the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their presence in a world otherwise stripped bare. Yet comradeship had its shadow too, because every bond carried the risk of loss. To grow close was to invite grief, and soldiers who lost friends often carried the weight silently, tucking it deep inside, because words could not mend what absence carved. Some men hardened themselves, avoiding attachments, but most found the pull of camaraderie irresistible, because survival was too heavy a burden to carry alone. And so, even in grief, they held fast to each other, stitching loss into memory, telling stories of the fallen to keep them alive in words if not in flesh. What historians sometimes miss is that this comradeship was more than strategy or morale. It was the heart of soldiering, the pulse that beat beneath every march, every dugout, every moment of endurance. To be a German soldier in those years was to live inside a web of quiet brotherhood, where trust and laughter, ritual and risk, gave men the strength to face what alone would have broken them. And as you drift deeper now, you can almost feel that bond, the warmth of another shoulder against yours, the sound of tired laughter rising in the dark, the unspoken promise that you were not alone. And this is what carries us gently forward into the next part of the story. How comradeship, as strong as it was, still could not shield men from the relentless intrusion of fear. A fear that was constant, shapeless, and yet strangely intimate, the silent companion that walked beside them in every trench, every march, every night. If comradeship was the thread that bound soldiers together, then fear was the silent companion that never left their side, the shadow that walked with them in every trench, on every march, in every restless night. For the German soldier, fear was not always the sudden terror of battle, but a constant, low hum in the background, like the faint ringing of a bell that never stopped. It lived in the quiet moments, the pause before stepping out of a dugout, the silence after an order was given, the stillness before dawn when men waited for the whistle of shells that might or might not come. Soldiers rarely spoke openly of fear. To admit it felt dangerous, as though words might give it more power, so they disguised it in jokes, in rituals, in silence. They teased one another about shaking hands, about boots that quivered on their own, about hearts that pounded louder than artillery, and in the laughter, some of the heaviness lifted. Yet beneath the laughter, every man knew that fear was real, unavoidable, and in many ways necessary. Diaries often describe the strange physical weight of it, stomachs twisting as though tied in knots, mouths going dry, hands trembling even while loading rifles, ears straining for sounds that might signal danger. Fear sharpened the senses until the world seemed unbearably vivid. The smell of damp earth, the crack of a twig, the flicker of a shadow across the trench wall. Some men claimed that fear became so familiar that it felt like a companion, something to be carried, managed, even relied upon. A soldier once wrote that he spoke silently to his fear, telling it to sit beside him rather than inside him, as though negotiating with a stubborn friend. Others turned fear into superstition, clutching talismans, whispering prayers, refusing to wear certain items of clothing during battle because they were convinced it brought bad luck. Fear crept into sleep as well, shaping dreams into twisted reflections of battle, turning rest into another kind of struggle. Soldiers muttered in their sleep, cried out, clutched their blankets like weapons, and woke with eyes wide, heart hammering, only to find that dawn had not yet arrived and the war still waited. And yet, even as fear hollowed men out, it also pushed them forward. It kept them alert on watch duty. It gave their legs strength to keep marching. It sharpened their hearing in the dark. Without it, perhaps survival would have been impossible. Strange stories circulate in letters and accounts. Men joking that they feared their officers more than the enemy. Others laughing that the cold itself was scarier than bullets. Others admitting that what terrified them most was not death, but the thought of being forgotten, of fading into the earth unnamed. These confessions, rare but honest, reveal the shape of fear more clearly than any battle description. And still, despite the dread, men managed to carry on, lighting cigarettes with trembling hands, humming songs off-key to mask their nerves, checking and rechecking rifles as though ritual could anchor them against chaos. The greatest fear of all was often not the shell or the bullet, but the waiting, the endless uncertainty of not knowing when or where danger would strike. Soldiers said the silence before an attack was more unbearable than the attack itself, because the imagination filled the quiet with horrors sharper than reality. And as you rest now, you can almost feel that strange tension, the way fear settled into bones, not as a scream but as a whisper, always present, always there, always reminding men that each breath was fragile and precious. Precious. And this leads us, gently but surely, into the next part of the story. How soldiers, living with constant fear, also learned to carry courage. Not the grand courage of stories and statues, but the quiet, stubborn courage of enduring, of rising each morning, of stepping forward even when the heart begged to turn back. If fear was the shadow that never left, then courage was not its opposite, but its companion, woven into the same fabric, not as the grand heroism of statues or stories, but as the quiet, stubborn persistence of taking one more step, one more breath, one more day. For the German soldier, courage rarely looked like charging across a battlefield with a flag raised high. More often, it looked like standing guard in freezing rain without falling asleep, or carrying a wounded comrade across mud while his own legs trembled, or writing a letter home with steady words, even when despair clawed at the edges of his heart. It was not courage that made men fearless, but courage that allowed them to move despite fear, to laugh despite hunger, to endure despite exhaustion. Diaries reveal this subtle truth again and again. Men describing courage as holding on rather than fighting on, courage as the act of sharing bread even when hungry, courage as staying awake during long nights because they knew others were counting on them. Some soldiers even joked about it, saying that courage was simply the inability to run fast enough away from danger, or that it was nothing more than stubbornness disguised as bravery. And yet, beneath the humor was a recognition that courage, however quiet, was what allowed them to survive. Soldiers drew it from one another. A man who faltered often found strength in the steady presence of a comrade beside him, in a word muttered under breath, in a hand laid briefly on his shoulder. Courage was contagious in these moments, passed silently from one man to the next, a ripple of resolve that steadied the line. It also took strange, unexpected forms. A soldier refusing to surrender his diary, even when ordered to lighten his pack. Another sneaking food to a starving villager despite orders. Another singing softly during bombardments to calm not only himself, but those listening in the dark. These small acts of defiance against despair were as much courage as any medal-winning deed. But courage carried its own weight, for it demanded constant renewal. Every dawn, every march, every battle asked for it again, draining reserves that never seemed full enough. Some men confessed to feeling guilty when they could not muster it, when fear or exhaustion overwhelmed them, but others reassured that even trembling hands could still be brave so long as they kept moving. What history often forgets is that courage was not always noble. Sometimes it was grim, born from the refusal to collapse. Sometimes it was bitter, born from anger at officers or the enemy. Sometimes it was mechanical, the body carrying on, long after the spirit wanted to stop. Yet all of it was courage nonetheless, because it meant survival against odds. And perhaps this is the most striking truth, that courage for the German soldier was not about glory, but about endurance, about remaining human in a place that sought to strip humanity away. As you lie here now, listening, you can almost feel that quiet persistence, that steady rhythm of men carrying themselves and each other forward, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, through mud, smoke, and silence. And this, softly, leads us into the next part of the story. How, alongside fear and courage, soldiers also carried guilt for survival. Guilt for choices made or not made. Guilt that would haunt them long after the guns fell silent. If courage was the quiet persistence of survival, then guilt was the shadow that followed it, settling into the minds of German soldiers, not only in moments of decision, but in the long hours afterward, whispering questions that never found answers. Guilt arrived in many forms. The guilt of surviving when comrades did not. The guilt of obeying orders that weighed against conscience. The guilt of knowing that while they fought and endured, families back home struggled under rationing, bombings, and absence. Soldiers rarely spoke of it openly, but it bled into diaries, into hesitant words and letters, into the silences that stretched between comrades after battles. One man might write, "I ate while another starved," another confessed, "I lived while my friend fell beside me," and another scrawled only, "I cannot explain what I have seen," before crossing it out. Survival itself became a source of guilt, as though breathing was an undeserved privilege in a war that claimed so many. Soldiers felt it when they carried back the packs of fallen comrades, when they stood at roll call and saw empty spaces, when they opened letters addressed to men who would never return to read them. Guilt also rose in encounters with civilians. Walking through villages where houses smoldered, seeing the eyes of women and children watching silently from doorways, feeling the weight of destruction that uniforms could not excuse. Some soldiers softened their steps, shared scraps of food, offered cigarettes as gestures of apology, while others avoided eye contact altogether, unable to face the reflection of war in human eyes. Even humor carried traces of guilt. Jokes about borrowing livestock, about taking over abandoned houses, about the absurdity of eating from dishes that once belonged to families. Laughter that was nervous, edged with unease, because beneath it lay the truth that their survival sometimes came at the expense of others. Diaries note unusual details. Soldiers planting flowers in dugouts as though to honor the dead. Others carrying trinkets from destroyed homes, but later confessing they could not bear to keep them, throwing them away on the road. These small acts reveal how guilt pressed into their lives like fingerprints in soft clay, reshaping even the smallest gestures. And still, soldiers carried on, because the machinery of war left no pause for reflection. There were always orders, marches, duties, demands that pushed guilt into the background, though it never left. Some found ways to ease it, through prayer, through rituals of remembrance, through telling stories of fallen comrades so they would not be forgotten. Others tried to bury it, pretending it did not exist, though it surfaced in dreams, in sudden bursts of silence, in eyes that stared too long at nothing. What history often forgets is that guilt was not only about what soldiers did, but about what they could not do, the friend they could not save, the letter they could not send, the moment they could not change. And perhaps this is the deepest wound, not the battles themselves, but the memories of choices that never seemed enough. To be a German soldier was to carry this weight in silence, to smile when needed, to march when ordered, but to feel inside the constant ache of questions, without answers. As you rest now, perhaps you can feel that heaviness too, the way guilt lingers long after moments pass, the way it shapes memory and identity, even in silence. And this leads us softly into the next part of the story. How soldiers, weighed down by guilt, also found themselves clinging ever more tightly to memory itself, not only of what they lost, but of what they wanted to preserve, fragments of humanity kept alive through stories, objects, and rituals that became their true inheritance from the war. If guilt was the shadow that haunted soldiers, then memory was the fragile thread they clung to, weaving together fragments of humanity in a world that seemed determined to erase it. German soldiers carried memories not only in their minds, but in objects, gestures, and rituals that transformed the unbearable present into something endurable. A folded photograph tucked inside a tunic, edges worn soft by constant touch, became more than paper. It was a piece of home pressed against the heart. A ribbon from a sweetheart, a coin from a father, a small wooden cross carved in secret. Each item served as a talisman, not just of luck, but of remembrance, proof that they had lived other lives before the mud and gunfire. Soldiers wrote diaries on scraps of paper, in the margins of military booklets, on the backs of maps, scribbling not just battles and movements, but the smell of spring air in a ruined village, the sound of birdsong after artillery, the taste of apples stolen from an orchard. These fragments, so small, were acts of resistance against forgetting. Some men memorized poems, reciting them in whispers at night. Others told stories of their families, passing them around the dugout like shared treasures. Even jokes, repeated night after night, became a form of memory, reminding them that laughter had once been easy, that life had once been more than endurance. Unusual details appear again and again in accounts. Soldiers pressing flowers into notebooks, sketching barns or rivers as though to carry landscapes home in lines of charcoal, saving buttons, stones, or feathers as keepsakes of places no one else might ever remember. One soldier admitted that he carried a spoon throughout the entire war because it reminded him of childhood meals. Another described collecting matches, not for fire, but because each one marked a day survived. Memory also lived in ritual. Before sleep, men sometimes spoke aloud the names of those lost, as though refusing to let them vanish. Others whispered blessings over food, even when the food was nothing more than stale bread. These rituals were small monuments, erected not in stone but in silence, and they kept alive the sense that life had meaning beyond orders and survival. And yet, memory carried pain too, because to remember was to feel again, to ache again, to long for what was absent. Some soldiers confessed they tried to forget, tried to erase home from their minds, because the distance was too sharp to bear. But memory, like smoke, seeped through cracks no matter how tightly doors were closed. Even the smell of tobacco could summon a father's pipe. The crack of firewood could summon a kitchen hearth. The sight of children in a village could summon the laughter of sons and daughters unseen for years. In this way, memory was both comfort and torment, both balm and wound, and soldiers lived caught between the two. What history often overlooks is how fiercely men fought to protect memory in the midst of destruction, as if preserving a fragment of the past was itself an act of survival. And perhaps that is the deeper truth. The war sought to grind men into uniformity, to strip them of individuality, yet memory refused to be erased. To be a German soldier was to carry, even in silence, a secret archive of images, words, and gestures. that proved they were more than weapons in a vast machine. And as you lie here now, drifting deeper into rest, you can almost feel those memories yourself. The weight of a folded photograph, the whisper of a name spoken in the dark, the stubborn glow of a memory that refuses to fade. And this leads us softly into the final part of the story, where we find not only the close of the war, but the quiet reflections of men who survived it, and how their memories, both heavy and fragile, shaped the rest of their lives long after. The guns had fallen silent, and so, as the war finally bent toward its end, the German soldier found himself standing not in triumph, but in exhaustion, not in glory, but in the long shadow of years that had reshaped him beyond recognition. The end did not arrive as a sudden release, but as a slow unraveling, days of marching back through ruined landscapes, of hearing rumors of defeat, whispered before they were officially declared, of watching uniforms grow ragged while once proud. Banners lay tattered in mud. For many, the war ended in captivity, trudging into prisoner-of-war camps where barbed wire framed the horizon, where meals were meager but strangely free of fear, where men slept without the whistle of shells overhead, yet could not silence the echoes inside their minds. For others, it ended in the slow walk home through a country scarred beyond recognition, towns flattened, families scattered, streets that no longer resembled the memories carried in letters and photographs. And for those who did return home, there was another war waiting. The war inside themselves, the quiet reckoning with guilt, with memory, with loss. They carried comrades' names like unspoken prayers, carried the smell of mud and smoke in their clothes even after washing, carried the weight of laughter that had once filled dugouts but now echoed only in memory. Some found solace in silence, never speaking of what they had seen. Others filled notebooks with words, hoping that by recording, they could let go. Still others told stories only to fellow veterans, men who understood without needing explanations. Unusual details linger in their recollections, the sound of boots striking frozen ground still echoing in their dreams, the habit of hoarding crumbs long after hunger had passed, the reflex of ducking at sudden noises years after the last artillery had fired. Humor survived too, fragile but stubborn, men recalling lice as their most loyal companions, soup as their greatest enemy, boots as the true generals of the war. And yet beneath the laughter was reflection, a recognition that their lives had been shaped by a paradox. They had been ordinary men caught in extraordinary machinery, forced to live through contradictions of fear and courage, despair and beauty, guilt and memory. To be a German soldier was not to be a symbol but a human being, one whose life was reduced to cycles of waiting, marching, surviving, and remembering. And perhaps that is the soft truth that history often forgets, that behind every uniform, behind every photograph of ranks and marshes, were men who longed for warmth, for bread, for laughter, for home. As you lie here now, perhaps with your eyes closed, you may feel the quiet loop of this story settling into you. The rhythm of boots on soil, the whisper of letters read by candlelight, the fragile songs hummed in dugouts, the breath of men who carried on not because of glory, but because breath itself demanded to be carried. Maybe your eyes are heavy now, your body sinking deeper into rest, as though you too are laying down the burdens of a long march. And if so, let these final words settle gently around you. History is not only battles and leaders, but the soft, human truths of those who lived unseen within it. Perhaps your eyes are closed already. Perhaps your breathing has slowed, and if sleep has come, let it take you kindly. But if you are still awake, hear this one last whisper, that in remembering these quiet stories, you too are part of keeping them alive, part of ensuring that even the smallest voices of history are not lost. So rest now, knowing that the story is complete, and that tomorrow brings another chance to listen, to remember, to reflect. And if you found peace in this journey, Be sure to subscribe, so that on another night, when you are ready to drift again into calm, you will find you waiting with another quiet story. Until then, good night, and may the silence of history wrap you gently into sleep. The war may have ended, but for the German soldier, its echo lingered in ways words can only faintly trace. And it is in those echoes that the true ending lies, not in the signing of papers, nor in the surrender of weapons, but in the quiet moments that followed, when men who had carried mud, hunger, fear, and memory were left with silence too heavy to name. They walked home on roads lined with ruins, past churches without roofs, past fields sown not with crops, but with shrapnel, carrying packs lighter than before, but hearts burdened with things unseen. Some entered houses where windows stared empty, and walls leaned like tired bodies. Others found strangers in the places where families had once lived, and still others found only absence, an absence that pressed more sharply than any wound. For many, captivity became its own strange chapter. Barbed wire stretching across landscapes, it confined their steps, but not their thoughts. Where meals were thin but fears less sharp, where time became both punishment and gift. And yet, even here, the rituals endured. A soldier carving wood in a camp, another humming a song into the night, another holding a photograph as though it alone could tether him to the life before. When freedom finally came, the soldiers carried with them habits they could not release, saving crumbs at the edge of plates, waking at sudden noises, folding clothes with the precision of barracks life, staring too long at horizons as though waiting for orders that never came. Some spoke of the war often, as if sharing would lighten it. Others locked it inside silence, allowing only fragments to slip out in unfinished sentences or quiet sighs. And yet, whether spoken or hidden, the story lived on, carried into families, into towns, into history itself, not as grand declarations, but as small truths, the hunger that taught men to value bread, the laughter that softened the edge of fear, the comradeship that held them when nothing else could, the memory of stars glimpsed above trenches, as proof that beauty survived even where destruction reigned. And perhaps this is where the story rests most gently, not in battles, not in victories or defeats, but in the simple humanity of men who endured, who longed for home, who carried memories like fragile lights through darkness. As you sink now into your own rest, you may feel that same quiet thread, the reminder that history is not only noise and names, but whispers, gestures, and breaths carried forward. So let your eyes close softly. Let the march fade into silence. Let the letters fold into memory, and let the story settle not as weight, but as calm. For in remembering it, you keep alive not only history, but the humanity that quietly endured within it. Good night.